You're watching Q News. I'm Hani Saif and welcome to our ongoing coverage of the rising tensions in Lebanon. As military operations escalate and civilian areas come under increasing strain, we'll take a closer look at the latest developments and their implications for the region. Stay with us as we cover the unfolding situation in Lebanon.
كل المستهدفين هن مدنيين.
وضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has urged the UN to withdraw its peacekeeping forces from southern Lebanon, citing concerns that their presence endangers both UNIFIL personnel and Israeli soldiers. In a message to UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, Netanyahu warned that failing to withdraw UNIFIL forces would leave them vulnerable to Hezbollah, endangering both their lives and those of Israeli soldiers. He stressed on the need to remove UNIFIL troops from combat zones. Lebanese Prime Minister Najib Mikati has criticized Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's call for UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres to withdraw UNIFIL forces from southern Lebanon. Mikati characterized Netanyahu's request as a new chapter in the occupation's disregard for international legitimacy and its resolutions. He affirmed Lebanon's strong commitment to international law and UN Security Council Resolution 1701, emphasizing the vital cooperation between UNIFIL forces and the Lebanese army in maintaining peace and stability in the southern region. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has told her Israeli counterpart Benjamin Netanyahu that attacks on UN peacekeepers in Lebanon are unacceptable. That came in a phone conversation with Netanyahu, where Meloni also called for the full implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1701 on Lebanon and emphasized the urgent need for a de-escalation of conflict in the region.
Non è accettabile, viola quanto stabilito dalla risoluzione 1701 delle Nazioni Unite. Il governo
Hezbollah has clashed with Israeli forces in southern Lebanon, escalating tensions with airstrikes, drone attacks and evacuations. U.S. concerns grow over Israel's targeting of UN peacekeepers.
Hezbollah reported that its fighters engaged in direct combat with Israeli occupation forces attempting to infiltrate the southern Lebanese town of Ramiyah, resulting in casualties among Israeli troops. Israeli media confirmed the confrontation, citing a military spokesperson who detailed clashes between Hezbollah fighters and Israeli occupation forces, specifically mentioning the 8th Brigade and the Elite 707 Loader Unit. The spokesperson claimed that the Israeli occupation forces responded with airstrikes, killing several Hezbollah members. Sirens blared in northern Israel, signaling escalation of these developments. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin expressed concern over Israel's continued attacks on UNIFIL positions, urging his Israeli counterpart Yoav Gallant to prioritize the safety of international peacekeeping forces and the Lebanese military. Israel's repeated strikes on peacekeepers raised serious questions about its disregard of international protocols. Hezbollah also launched drone strikes targeting the outskirts of Tel Aviv, as Israel responded by imposing closures around several northern towns. In a further act of aggression, Israeli occupation forces ordered the evacuation of residents from 23 villages in southern Lebanon, displacing more civilians and extending the zone of conflict from the Bekaa Valley to the Mediterranean. Intensified Israeli attacks have led to the displacement of nearly 1.2 million Lebanese, exacerbating the humanitarian crisis in the region as Israel's offensive continues to fuel hostilities and unrest.
And for further analysis on the situation, we're joined from Beirut by the journalist Ibrahim Rihan. Mr. Rihan, welcome to Qnews. First off, how do you view the continuation of the Israeli violations in Lebanon, despite the international community's rejection of them?
Good evening to you and to your audience. What happens on the borders and the pressure being packed on the UNIFIL comes in the framework of the Israeli policy announced by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which is asking for the withdrawal of UNIFIL from south of Lebanon. In his message to the Secretary General of the United Nations, he knows that his country will be able to fill the place that will be left empty when the troops withdrawn. Also, Tel Aviv have many remarks on the mandates and the function of UNIFIL, and several times over the past 2 years, they tried to amend their mandate to become under Chapter 7. They also want these troops to have mandates to raid houses without being accompanied or without giving information or notice to the Lebanese forces, which shows that the Israelis want to replace these forces with multinational forces, including Americans and British, from those whom Tel Aviv trusts. But it's not easy to do this, especially that UNIFIL informed the Israeli side that they wouldn't withdraw except for a UN Secretary Council resolution is issued, which didn't happen. Let's take into consideration the international conflict inside the United Nations between the United States from one side and Russia from another side. France is a main actor in the UNIFIL, and they want to protect these troops, and they try also to play a political role here.
Well, do you see that Netanyahu's recent statements of withdrawing the UNIFIL troops from their positions a clear indication of Israel's readiness for a ground incursion into Lebanon?
Doubtlessly, the forces mobilized on the borders with Lebanon are much more than the troops participated in June 2006. In that war, only 3 teams from the army participated, which gives an indication that the operation will be much bigger than said in the media and in the statements. But take into consideration what was said by the Israeli Defense Minister. He talked about the destruction of the front villages and preventing the party's members from returning to them, which shows conflict in the goals of the Israeli government behind this operation. In addition, U.S. administration refuses any invasion of Lebanon, south of Lebanon. Maybe Netanyahu waits for the end of the U.S. elections until he takes his decision, but definitely today he is seeking to invade from 1 to 5 kilometers inside the south of Lebanon, and in the further phase he will decide to either expand this invasion or would withdraw after the destruction of the front villages under the justification of hitting the assets or the attacking assets of Hezbollah.
Well, the Secretary General Antonio Guterres asked Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for an explanation for his statements of withdrawing the UNIFIL forces. Now, can the United Nations and the Security Council take any strong decisions to stop the Israeli attacks on southern Lebanon?
We have watched this in Gaza Strip, where the international resolutions and international laws were totally neglected. Even the initiative launched by U.S. President Joe Biden was adopted by Security Council. However, Netanyahu refused it, despite he participated in the proposed draft submitted by Biden. So we are facing new Israeli mentality related to the pattern of war, the political pattern of these those wars and the political pattern at the international level, because they do not pay any attention to UN resolutions or to the UNIFIL or to the international law, because there is a Syrian side on the borders. Sometimes they invade from to the areas under supervision of Dove forces affiliated to the United Nations. So we are facing a new mentality.
Mr. Ibrahim Rihan from Beirut, the journalist, thank you very much, sir, for joining us. And Hezbollah has launched a guided missile attack on an Israeli occupation force attempting a ground infiltration in the southern Lebanese town of Ramya. Over the past hours, Hezbollah conducted 27 operations, ranging from repelling Israeli incursion attempts to targeting Israeli military positions. Hezbollah also targeted Israeli sites in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights for the first time. Israeli media have reported explosions in Akre and Nahariya in northern Israel following the latest rocket barrage from southern Lebanon. The Israeli occupation army has confirmed that Hezbollah launched approximately 320 projectiles on various parts of Israel, resulting in 3 injuries in western Galilee and 12 others with minor injuries in other locations. Lebanon is facing an unprecedented humanitarian crisis as intensified Israeli airstrikes displace over 1 million people, turning schools into shelters amid the country's deepening economic struggles.
Lebanon is facing an unprecedented humanitarian crisis as Israeli airstrikes intensify in southern regions and Beirut, forcing tens of thousands to flee their homes. The Lebanese government has responded by converting hundreds of schools and public institutions into shelters, closing classrooms indefinitely to accommodate the growing number of displaced citizens. This mass exodus has led to the largest displacement in Lebanon's history as civilians flee northward to escape relentless bombardment, drawing parallels to the crisis in Gaza, where schools have similarly become emergency shelters. The ongoing conflict between Hezbollah and Israeli occupation forces has displaced over 1 million people, according to local and international estimates. Lebanese caretaker Prime Minister Najib Mikati warned that Lebanon, already grappling with a severe economic downturn, is struggling to provide shelter, medical care, and humanitarian aid to the displaced population. He described the situation as the largest displacement the country has ever seen, further straining Lebanon's fragile economy. Observers suggest that Israel may be deliberately displacing residents of southern Lebanon as part of a broader strategy. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office hinted as a political exchange, suggesting that the return of Lebanese civilians to the south could be linked to Israeli citizens returning to northern Israel, contingent on Hezbollah halting its missile attacks. The situation continues to escalate, with civilians across the region caught in the crossfire of Israel's aggressive military campaign, worsening the humanitarian fallout on both sides.
For further analysis on this topic, we're joined from Beirut by the Lebanese Member of Parliament, Mr. Fadi Karam. Welcome, Mr. Karam, to Q News. Now, in light of Prime Minister Netanyahu's remarks about potentially targeting UNIFIL forces, how do you interpret these comments? Do you see this as a genuine threat or is it a strategic political move?
حركة سياسية استراتيجية.
لا عم أسمع الترجمة إذا بتريد.
Mr. Karam, now, in light of the Prime Minister's Netanyahu's remarks about targeting the UNIFIL forces, Do you interpret these comments as a genuine threat on the ground, or do you see it as a strategic political rhetoric, a strategic move?
The situation in
تنتهي
south of
من
Lebanon, they want
1701
to end the resolution 1701
تذهب إلى
to
قرار أممي آخر
find
يناسب
another UN resolution that suits the new situation at the military and security levels that Israel is aspiring for, which is excluding the military power of Hezbollah after
اللي ربما بعد الأول يعني بعد صيدا
after Saida.
من الظاهر أنه إسرائيل تطمح
It seems that
أو
Israel
تسعى
is
إلى حرب استنزافي
ambitious to a draining war
تنتهي
that
بقرار
ends
أممي
with new UN resolutions.
Well, how do you perceive Hezbollah's recent development? How do Hezbollah perceive the recent development, especially regarding their stance on the UNIFIL forces? What actions, might they consider in response to Israel's threats, especially with reports coming of Israel actually capturing one of Hezbollah elements?
قد تأثر كثيرا من العناصر وقد يكون هناك
It may capture many elements. There might be capturing from both sides, but what Hezbollah is doing today is trying to
مواجهة عسكرية على الأرض
stay in a military confrontation on the ground, southern Lebanon. Definitely, Hezbollah prefers the field war more than hiding and taking strikes, because there's a great difference in the operations regarding weapons, mega weapons and airplanes. But as for the field confrontation, there will be captured people from both sides. Today, Hezbollah talks about Resolution 1701 that they should have obliged to before the beginning of the war in Lebanon. This is what we called for, that Hezbollah should adhere to UN Resolution 1701 in order to make Lebanon avoid this war of attrition. But they didn't take it positively and preferred what they called the support of Gaza. However, they never supported Gaza in anything.
What about, Mr. Karam, what about the Lebanese government? Are they taking steps, is it taking steps to address the threats posed by Israel's recent actions? Are there plans to strengthen cooperation with UNIFIL?
A plan, because the main drive of Hezbollah is Iran. Iran sent two delegates last week who are the Minister of Foreign Affairs Aranji and the head of the Parliament of Iran to explain that they will continue to support Hezbollah and ask Hezbollah to continue the resistance and the war with the goal of making Hezbollah continue to defend Iran and to distract Israel in Lebanon, Gaza, Syria, Iraq, and in Yemen as well. So the Israeli strikes wouldn't reach Iran, which is the end goal of Israel. Hence, everything that is done by Hezbollah is a trial to deter Israel or to reach an understanding with Israel regarding Resolution 1701 with some of the troops, not with all the items, especially the items on
Mr. Karam, now we've seen the statements by the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and the statements by the French President Emmanuel Macron. Now, what role do you foresee the international community in helping to de-escalate the situation?
كل المحاولات اللي عم تأتي على
All the
لبنان من
attempts
قبل الدول النافذة والقوى
by the big countries or big states are trying to cease the fire, but it's not about ceasefire only.
عدم إتمام
It should be about completing a settlement
والإبقاء على سلاح حزب الله. أخطر أمن شمالي
That was the Lebanese Member of Parliament, Mr. Fedi Karam. Thank you very much for joining us. Moving on, Saudi Arabia has officially launched a relief air bridge to Lebanon in response to ongoing Israeli attacks. The first plane carrying food, medical supplies and humanitarian aid has departed from Riyadh to Beirut. A relief team is also accompanying the mission to support rescue operations. Director of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Mohammed al-Nassour, has stated that Israeli forces are deliberately targeting densely populated areas in Beirut. He added that the humanitarian situation in Lebanon is worsening as displaced families are forced to live in the streets without shelter, while many Lebanese hospitals are out of service. The Lebanese government has suspended the current school year amid relentless Israeli attacks that have claimed over 2,000 lives and displaced more than 1.2 million people. Hundreds of thousands have sought refuge in schools across the country, with many staying for nearly 2 months. Lebanon has students enrolled in primary and secondary education and a teaching workforce of more than 87,800, with 55% employed in the private sector. In 2022, there were almost 36,000 teachers in primary education. The Lebanese Red Cross has announced that 4 paramedics were injured in an Israeli airstrike on a home in the southern town of Sirbin. The Red Cross confirmed that its ambulances were targeted despite receiving clearance from UNIFIL to move towards a Lebanese army checkpoint that had been attacked by Israeli forces. The Lebanese news agency reported that civilians were also injured in an Israeli strike on a building in the Baqsta Sharhabil area near Sidon. Additionally, Israeli aircraft targeted a vehicle in the Beqa Valley in eastern Lebanon. Rescue operations continue in central Beirut as teams search for survivors trapped beneath the rubble after Israel's deadliest airstrikes on the city. The narrow roads in the area are complicating efforts to clear the debris and reach those still buried. While Israel claims its strikes target Hezbollah, civilians remain the primary victims. The Israeli forces have struck many numerous towns and intensified their attacks on Khiyam village in Nabateya in southern Lebanon. Smoke over there was seen from Marjayun. And earlier, Israel ordered residents of 21 more Lebanese villages to evacuate to areas north of the Awali River, which flows through southern Lebanon as it intensifies its attacks in the region. Rubble and debris from collapsed buildings now fill the streets of Nabateya, a southern Lebanese city following Israeli airstrikes. Damaged cars, piles of rubble and broken mannequins from destroyed stores line the streets. This devastation follows Israel's announcement of continued operations in southern Lebanon, aimed at dismantling Hezbollah's infrastructure. And by this we conclude our coverage for this hour, but please don't forget to follow us on Qnews on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram and TikTok at QNewsEG. And for more real-time updates, connect with us on the UMS digital platform. Watch it. I'm Hani Saif. Thank you for joining us.